And 2 seconds. Hi, everyone who has joined us on Facebook. We're going to be starting just shortly. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for joining us, everyone who is an attendee as well. Hi, everybody. Welcome to New Detroit's Town Hall. I am Marshall Favors, Director of Community Engagement for New Detroit. New Detroit is a coalition of leaders working to achieve racial understanding and racial equity in metropolitan Detroit. You can learn more about us at newdetroit.org. I am so excited about today's Town Hall. Our topic is centered around a recently released report, COVID-19 in Detroit, Impact on Education, that New Detroit has released. And the report can also be found on our website. So I have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator for today to get our conversation started. So I'd like to welcome Jamie K. Walters. She's the COO, Head of Marketing and Talent for VBK PR Plus Creative. And she's also a mom of 2 school-age children who have been navigating the pandemic and this school situation that all of us have had to do during the pandemic. Please welcome Jamie.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you, New Detroit. Thank you, the panelists and the guests who came here today to have this really important conversation. While headlines about education focus on the debate over mask mandates in school and virtual versus in-person teaching, what are we overlooking? I know that in my household, I am sure there are a lot of things that I'm going to see as being a result of these 2 years of COVID and how it affects their education. How have schools and students been impacted by the pandemic over the past couple of years, and what are the future implications? We have an informed panel here to help us hash all this out and give us, hopefully there will be some hope at the end of this. I know there will probably be a lot of really sort of frank sort of information that comes out of this, but we also need to know where we're going and how we can sort of work through this. So first up is Jane Fran Morgan. She is the president of JFM Consulting Group, a Detroit-based strategy, planning, and evaluation consulting firm. As a founder of JFM with more than 20 years experience, Jane leads the dynamic team of work and works in partnership with diverse nonprofits, philanthropic, and public sector clients, like New Detroit. Jane brings her experience in planning and evaluation and applied social research to programs, policy, systems change, and cross-sector collaborations. She's committed to helping out local, state, national organizations and institutions make informed, data-driven strategic decisions. And she was the author of this report that New Detroit released. So we welcome Jane. Next, we have Amber Arellano. Is the executive director of the Education Trust Midwest. Throughout her career as a journalist, strategic communicator, and civic leader, she has worked tirelessly to improve the opportunities for all children. As a nonprofit leader, she has launched several organizations and initiatives that seek to ensure every child in this country has access to a great public education. In 2020, Ed Trust Midwest convened a standing statewide coalition focused on equity and education called the Michigan Partnership for Equity and Opportunity. Thank you, Amber, for being here today. And then Andrea Cole is the executive director and the CEO of the Ethel and James Flinn Foundation. The foundation is committed to improving the scope, quality, and delivery of mental health services in Michigan and awards grants to develop, evaluate, and implement best practice treatment programs. All right, let's get started. Jane, you were up first. You are the one who authored this report. So what are your top line findings in this report?
So top line findings were, obvious to everyone is that COVID had an impact on all of us, all of our lives, particularly on students, children, and students in school. It was really really tough on students in a number of ways. And so we found the issues falling into kind of three buckets that we focused on in the report. One was in terms of school funding, which has been inequitable, frankly. And there's, lots of data going back years to show that. But COVID-19 really did shine a bright light on what a lot of those inequities were, and the pandemic exacerbated those inequities. So lack of equitable funding, not equal funding, but equitable funding was a major issue. There were myriad issues related to remote learning because students were not. All students weren't on equal footing in terms of their ability to engage in remote learning, whether it was access to reliable internet service, having parents there who aren't essential workers, who are having to work, who are able to actually support their children, attendance issues, which were already a concern. Slightly more than half of the students were considered to be chronically absent, and that's missing 18 or more consecutive days of school. There were, in addition to attendance, academic issues, because obviously all of this ultimately is going to impact a student's ability to perform academically, and roughly 13% of students were flagged for retention. It just had a snowball effect in terms of children's ability to engage and learn remotely. And in addition to that, and connected to that, are mental health issues. In Detroit, as with many communities that have a high proportion of lower income students, there were a lot of pre-existing mental health issues going into the pandemic, which only made things worse. I mean, something like 62% of DPSCD students were experiencing symptoms, some mental health issues, depression, et cetera, among the girls in particular. And I mean, that's an outrageous number. So when you combine the mental health issues, the multiple issues related to remote learning, the inequitable funding of the schools, it just created an untenable environment for children to try to learn and succeed in. In terms of, okay, the so what of all of that, not surprisingly, funding is a huge part of this, is just in terms of both providing equitable funding for students in schools and communities that are, have Detroit socioeconomic demographics. So increasing the funding so that it matches the needs of the students attending school. Also, which calls for changing the model in terms of how schools are funded, and that needs to be addressed. And then also looking at what gets funded. So, bring more money in, yes, but also how should some of those dollars be spent? Allocating more resources to supporting students' mental and emotional well-being. So that's one bucket, is really related to funding. Will help to address and alleviate a lot of these issues. And the other related to that is focusing on students' mental health and well-being more. And I think we're going to hear more about that in terms of some of the specific programs to help address those issues, but ensuring that that those pieces are part of the system, that students have access to it and feel comfortable in accessing those resources.
Were you surprised by anything during this report, or did it?
So, I kind of roll around in data for a living. So in some respects, I feel a little bulletproof, but yes, I was surprised by some of the findings here. When I got to the 62% of DPSCD students reporting some, showing some signs of mental health or stress. That's a huge number. And, does that account for everyone? Could that number potentially be even higher? And thinking about children having to try to learn on top of all of that. So there were some data points that were jarring, for sure.
I was reminded, I remember right before the pandemic, I was reading this article in Chalkbeat, and they were talking about how this is before we knew a really pandemic was going to happen, that they were worried about where like the third grade testing was going to be at that time. And they were really, that people in the know were really sort of concerned that Michigan was just continuing on that downslide. So this doesn't really help the situation. But I think this is why we're here, is trying to figure out what the situation is and how we can move forward. Amber, Jane talked about equitable funding. So the Michigan legislature recently passed a budget that will allocate baseline funding of $8,700 for every student next year, regardless of school district. This compares with an estimated $10,421 per pupil cost to educate a student in Michigan. So we got almost a $2,000 sort of variance. Amber, can you please speak to the equitable funding issue raised in this report?
Sure. Well, first I want to congratulate New Detroit and Jane for the report. I think it's really thoughtfully done. There's a lot of really helpful data that sheds light on how kids in the city are doing, and data has been hard to come by in many respects during the pandemic, because we couldn't do the same kinds of assessments and other kinds of analyses that we normally do every year in public schools. So I think the New Detroit report is really important, and encourage people to take a look at it. And I want to start by saying, there is progress on equitable funding. In terms of increases, historic increases recently championed by Governor Whitmer. And that's been fantastic. Michigan is so woefully underfunded compared to other states. David Arson at Michigan State University is among the important researchers that have been documenting how our investment has not been keeping track with other states around the country for over 2 decades now. And I think we need to, make note of that progress and applaud wins where we see them. That said, that money has been very focused on more money for everyone. And there's been a narrative that's been kind of growing in the state that the pandemic, that all kids were affected by the pandemic, and they should, the resources should reflect that. It's true that all students have been affected. That's absolutely true. And as I could say, as a mom who was in the beginning of the pandemic, 2nd grade, now a 4th grader, I saw that so clearly. She was so far behind in reading, and it made that 2nd year of the pandemic particularly difficult, not only for us, but for her teachers. And I think that's all true. But I also think that kind of narrative is also dangerous, and that, we know that before the pandemic, there were huge opportunity gaps in Michigan. And that comes out in the achievement data, but it also comes out in terms of the opportunity data. It comes out in what we know in terms of providing very inequitable opportunities and support for students. And that shows up all kinds of ways, whether it's, Grand Rapids Public Schools having a terrible time being able to fill teacher positions because their salaries are so low because they can't afford to compete with suburban districts for pay. It comes up in districts not being able to have the capacity and support around supporting teachers in, best in class early reading instruction. It comes across in tutoring and after school and all kinds of enrichment opportunities that kids in affluent communities get every day. And it's so much driven by Michigan's funding system, which is arguably among the most inequitable and really most unfair in our country. We are now as a state, according to an analysis done by our national organization a couple of years ago, we're in the bottom 6 states in the country when it comes to equitable funding. When you look at the gap between high poverty districts and affluent districts and see what high poverty districts have in terms of resources and the resources that they're getting from the state. In one of our reports 2 years ago called Crisis and Opportunity, Michigan was one of only 16 states providing less funding to high poverty districts than to the lowest poverty districts in the state. And Michigan districts serving the highest rates of students for low-income families received about 5% less in state and local funding per student than more affluent districts. 5% might not seem like a lot, but in fact, it equates to millions of dollars annually. And the bigger the district, the more they feel that difference. And I think that there's been this narrative that the stimulus dollars was meant to sort of fill those inequitable gaps. And there have been times, as you all know, there were multiple stimulus opportunities and from the federal government. And some of them were distributed in an equitable way, but some of them weren't. They were distributed as if all districts and all students had the same needs. And we know that that's not true. We know that anecdotally, and we know that from research. I grew up in a very working poor community, for example. I grew up in Pontiac and Waterford Township. My mom was a single mom. We were on welfare for a decade. And what my mom was able to provide in terms of support and what our schools were able to provide in terms of the conditions to learn and thrive were radically different than what I can do now as somebody that lives in a much more affluent school district. And I see like the difference in what the opportunities that my daughter gets because of that. The kids where I grew up are no less intelligent and competent of the highest potential as the kids of the school district where I live now. And it really is deeply unfair. And I think in many ways kind of un-American that we don't provide students with the same levels of support through our funding system. And I say that because when we're listening to our best angels in our country, we have this idea that all men and women are created equal, and that we all should have a shot at the American dream, that all Americans should be able to climb a ladder to success. But ladders of success are built through great public education for all kids. It is really among the first rungs on the ladder of opportunity in our country. And we don't fund students based on their level of need and based in an equitable and fair way. We essentially create a false ladder. It's a false narrative. The ladder doesn't exist when we don't create those kinds of opportunities for all kids to grow and succeed and learn.
Andrea, I'm going to get to you in 1 second. I just want to follow up on one thing with Amber. There's, in terms of like the children that go to these live in higher income sort of communities. And there's a lot of supplementation that parents are also doing to help their kids along with school districts. So then when you see the numbers of where, college,
Absolutely.
all that stuff, it's this kind of false narrative in some way. And I don't mean to put you on the spot about this question, but I always love to look at, when I think about us being in the bottom, I'm like, who's doing it really well?
Yeah.
So what are the states that are doing it really well? And then we'll get to Andrea.
I love that you're connecting enrichment, right? And so not just happens in schools and classrooms, but what happens around schools and classrooms and in families and communities with the funding formula, with what we can learn from these leading education states. Great example of that is the state of Massachusetts, which you probably all know is not only the highest performing state in the country, top 1 or 2 for more than 20 years, but also is now has among one of the best funding formulas in terms of equitable funding. Just a few years ago, it revamped its funding formula out of a widespread consensus that even though it had become #1 in the country for all students, it's only #1 for some. And some groups of students have really have huge gaps there. Latino students in particular are at the bottom of the country when you compare Latino students in other states from Massachusetts. And so there was a real push there over many years, and it finally came to fruition through this new funding formula. And it's radically different than Michigan's. Instead of what we do here, which is called a weight, we do it about in theory, we're supposed to do more, but it never gets funded. I should say hardly ever gets funded in reality. And so the amount of money that we invest in low income students is only about 11.5% more than non-low income students. In Massachusetts, depending on the child's background and the community, and how much poverty there is in a community, Massachusetts may support that child funding as much as 100% more than a non-low income student. And if you think about that, it makes all the sense in the world, because being a low income student is different in Birmingham or Okemos than it is in Flint or Pontiac or Grand Rapids or Detroit, or the UP in a rural, desolate rural area. Vastly different in terms of what the community is able to provide for those children. And I think one thing that is also really notable about the Massachusetts model is that they actually really thought a lot about these enrichment opportunities, right? That do come through, often through private dollars, through affluent families, right? And you're absolutely right. I did that during the pandemic. I was able to supplement my daughter's learning through private tutors, which were very expensive, but my mom would have been able to do that. And my friends and family who live in the community where I grew up certainly couldn't do that. And it did lead to, we're seeing all of this in the data in terms of the gaps. So in places like Massachusetts, they've said part of this money should be reserved for districts and schools to be used for enrichment. It shouldn't just be for the in-school, the standard line items that districts and schools spend on. It should also be available for what happens outside of school, and what happens during the summer, what happens on the weekends for kids. And I think that's exactly the kind of funding formula that we should be moving toward in Michigan.
Thank you. Andrea, so mental health, right?
Yes.
Mental health is a big and consequential issue for students, and it's a difficult one for parents and teachers and even students themselves to track. Please tell us about Trails Detroit and the impact COVID is having on our children's mental health.
Sure, Jamie. So if you bear with me, I just want to share my screen. And good afternoon, everyone. Okay, can everyone see that?
I can.
Okay, great, perfect. So as Jane pointed out in her report, I just want to talk about what was going on before the pandemic. So as Jane pointed out, more than 60% of Detroit students were already experiencing anxiety and depression, and that was before the pandemic hit. So they weren't getting the care and the attention that they needed. So there was already a serious need for improved school-based mental health supports. So in 2019, 7 foundations, along with the Department of Health and Human Services, came together to support a district-wide approach to mental health supports in Detroit public schools. I don't like saying the CD, I'm still used to calling it Detroit public schools. So this is the idea of trails, and I'm going to talk about trails in a minute, but the plan was to implement trails in all 110 schools, K through 12, 50,000 students, 4,000 staff, and this was a 3-year commitment. And so as you can see below, these were the 7 funders who partnered for that effort. So now I want to talk about what Trails actually is. There's 3 levels of mental health programming. So the first tier is awareness and education. So these are curriculums that can be delivered in the classroom that really promote resiliency and just give kids coping skills, how to recognize symptoms, things that may trigger them, and then how they can deal with that and give them the tools to better manage. And there were 20 classroom lessons that are designed, and there's 4 grade bands, K. So we want to start at K. So K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and then 9 through 12. And Trails also includes some self-care tools for staff who are also dealing with stress and burnout. So the second tier of Trails, these are actually interventions, counseling, services in the school that can be delivered by the school staff, that's counselors, social workers, nurses, but actually help students who are having mental health difficulties right in the school. And obviously with the pandemic, one of the things that was added to Trails is coping with COVID-19. So these are virtual and in-person interventions that have been very effective during the pandemic and that have reached over 6,000 students. And then the other unique thing about Trails is it brings in community mental health providers into the schools who are trained in Trails to be able to offer that additional supports within the schools. And then the third level of programming for Trails is suicide risk management. So this is simply putting together a process, procedures, a way to identify students who may be at risk for suicide and then connect them to the appropriate care. And then working more closely with behavioral health agencies and hospitals so that when a child is experiencing difficulty, is at risk of suicide, that you can get them the help much faster than they've been getting it in the past. So that really is what Trails is in a nutshell. So I want to talk about where we are. As I stated earlier, we came together in 2019. That was before the pandemic. And honestly, that first year was really just built on looking at the needs on a school by school basis in Detroit Public Schools, looking what they had, looking at what services were there, what services were not, and really just planning to implement Trails. And then in 2020, of course, COVID-19 hit. So schools were closed. There was a significant delay in us moving forward with Trails. Obviously, if kids aren't in school, you can't really do much. And then we were dealing with a lot of staffing shortages, and then, teachers and schools trying to just focus on shifting to a virtual learning platform. So there have been quite a few delays in Trails, but the good news is that during the pandemic, they've been able to really focus on, again, creating this coping with COVID, which is a virtual intervention. This can be delivered to students and families right in their homes. Those services have already reached 6,000 students. And they were able to shift to training social workers on suicide risk management, developing that process. And then they continue to train teachers and staff virtually. So I wanted to put that into context that, Trails has had to deal with COVID as well. But then where we are now. So things are moving along nicely. Trails is going to be, tier 1 is going to be implemented in 13 schools. The second phase in 36 schools, any day now, it may have started. They've also been able to train all of the contracted school professionals that are working in DPS. They've all been trained in Trails. They've trained City Year to also deliver Trails curriculum. So with everything that's gone on in COVID, it is important more than ever that we stay committed to making sure that Trails is fully implemented in Detroit Public Schools. So we do have additional funding support for that. We're very happy about it. We are going to continue to focus on Trails, and it is being expanded statewide as well. So Trails is actually a really good solution that can provide equitable access to all students. So we are continuing to work in Detroit Public Schools. So that is it in a nutshell, and I am happy to answer any questions. And here's the website if you want to know more about Trails, trailstowellness.org. Thank you.
Thank you all. We're going to open it up to some questions.
Oh, let me stop sharing. Okay.
What are some immediate steps we can take in Michigan to move towards a more equitable funding formula comparable to states like Massachusetts? So Amber, I don't know if that's you or anyone else wants to speak to it.
I'm happy to chime in. So I think, there's both a conversation going on through this budget, and I'm sure there will be over the next couple of years on whether to move more dollars into at-risk student funding. That's sort of that's the most immediate way to invest more in a more equitable funding system. As you mentioned at the top of our conversation today, we have been convening a statewide equity coalition called, we call it MPEO for an acronym, the Michigan Partnership for Equity and Opportunity. It's made up of a very diverse and very interesting group of leaders and organizations from across the state. On both sides of the aisle. I think folks think that equity is just a Democratic issue, a progressive issue. The truth is that we have some of the most prominent conservative political leaders in the state that are part of our coalition and that are just sick, really sick about our funding formula and the kind of conditions that it creates in working class and poor communities across the state. So I think that our coalition and folks involved in our activism network will be working on that, really trying to provide support to the champions in the legislature, trying to get that done, and trying to create some heat on those that may not feel like that should be a priority. We feel like this is the time for that. Then I think there's like the larger work going on around what does structural reform look like? And I think that will be a big conversation over the next couple of years. And again, I think this is a real moment, not only for empathy for people working in schools and for parents and for kids. There's just so much exhaustion. It's been a really hard couple of years for people, but it's also a moment to turn things into activism. It's a moment to say, okay, there was a lot of these sorts of problems, structural inequities happening before the pandemic. The pandemic has exacerbated a lot of that, and we need to get active. We need to get more involved. And so I'll share a link for folks that might be interested in doing that. But I think this is a moment that's what we really need to be doing, is trying to engage more at the state and local level on how do we move to address these structural inequities that just really create, some not just strong wins, but like tsunamis against the people working in schools, and make it so hard for them to succeed because they're just often not set up for success.
And I would just add, Amber's the expert in that area, but just in terms of the research, as part of that process, just looking at some other models. Massachusetts for sure, Kansas City was lifted up in our research also as a great example. And so, there may be elements of that approach that can be borrowed that would be helpful in Michigan, but just taking the time to look and see, well, what do we know that works that might have some applicability here.
Jane, I was about to come to you next. I was lucky enough to sit and listen to Chastity Pratt, right? Chastity's been reporting on education for years. She's now at the Wall Street Journal, but she was talking about, we were at this thing and she said, raise your hand if you think your kids or your nephews or nieces go to a great school, right? And like everyone, raise their hand. And there's this idea that Michiganders feel like the Michigan education system might be better than it is. And I think there might be like a little bit of head in the sand that that many of us in the state, on all communities, are sort of, ignoring. So Jane, when you look at data, you spend your time working with data and looking at the success of Michigan, how important do you think education is in the success of Michigan on every sort of level as we look
I mean, you know, it touches everything. It's part of it's a huge piece of the economic development equation. I mean, to have a population that's well educated, that can take advantage of jobs, can create jobs, you know, through entrepreneurism. It's, you know, when you pull it out of if it's not working, then it's not working, not just for education or the children in school, but it's not working for the state. And it puts the entire state at economic peril. And you can see the relationship between, in terms of, you know, who you're able to attract in a state where education is working better than in others. So it's paramount.
I think it's true. And I think I'm feeling this sort of sense of urgency. Like we might have needed to be a little bit more urgent before the pandemic. And now, you know, you read this report, you kind of feel like, oh, we might be circling the drain a little bit. And that is super consequential to so much. I mean, these are people's lives. You look at, I mean, I look at my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old, like you know, how they sort of see the world is being shaped right now in many ways. Perhaps there's, you know, communities from the business community to the education community to other things that are looking at being sort of intentional and proactive. But one of the questions we have from the audience, Toby says, what can parents do to further this cause? Do you recommend that we join our student school boards? How can parents help, you know, better the situation for their children and the children in their community?
Well, I mean, certainly anywhere, you know, parent engagement is helpful at various levels, whether they're active in their child's school, whether they're, you know, running for school board. We're seeing nationally now a movement of parents running for school boards that, you know, depending on the situation is needs to be countered with, you know, parents who are with progressive parents who want to really ensure that all children are well supported in school. So that's part of it. It's you know, looking at who's using your influence as a resident, as a voter, in terms of helping to support and promote legislation that's going to support your child's education. Amber can speak to this as well, I'm sure, but there are a number of ways for parents to, and many roles for parents to play.
I think you know, the idea of getting on a school board is a great one, but it's also like using that platform to influence those appropriate circles in Lansing. So, you know, there are associations that represent school boards, our local leaders having conversations with them and saying, you know, we need a more equitable funding system. If you're a principal, are you talking with your principals association? If you're a teacher, you know, are you talking, you know, through your association or union? And then I think, like, for more direct advocacy, certainly, like, we invite people to get involved in our activism network to really lift up voices when those moments are available, right? And there really is a moment of opportunity for change. But I think all those things, getting involved in New Detroit, you might be involved in a parent network like Detroit Parent Network. Detroit Parent Network is a wonderful partner, and they're involved in our equity coalition. So I think there's, you know, for different people, there might be different fits, but there can all be powerful and impactful.
Andrea, you know, COVID has been really hard on every part of this community, right? And so as a parent, it's been hard on me. And so I'm like in my own sort of world, trying to deal with work and trying to deal with everything and kids. How do I sort of gauge how my children are doing? Like, I mean, I know it's a hard, like, not quantifiable thing, but like parents, how do you sort of assess how their children are doing And then what do you do about it? I mean, I know that the trails is
Yeah.
an option, but like, you know, you're sitting across from them at dinner. How do you know what's going on with them?
So that's such a great question, Jamie, because one of the things I didn't mention about trails, because this is more specific to the commitment in Detroit Public Schools, I did not mention this, but one thing that we wanted to do is make sure that there was a parent and family engagement and education piece, because in addition to a parent wanting to know, well, how do I know if my child needs help? I do want to address this. There's also, and this is especially in the Black community, that a lot of times we ourselves, our family members, we don't even want to talk about mental health. We may be struggling with issues of our own that we haven't addressed. So I think there's a couple of things that need to be addressed. We will help parents, give them some tools to recognize if my child is struggling, if they're not sleeping, or if their behavior is changing. What are some symptoms and signs? And that's part of the parent outreach and education piece that we'll do in Detroit Public Schools, but also being more comfortable talking about mental health in general and acknowledging your mental health condition. So I think that's what we're trying to do is build that parent and family, whoever that caretaker is, parents, siblings, grandmother, whoever it may be, that we need to raise awareness and education among families to be able to maintain their own mental health, but then be able to have some tools to help their children.
Thank you. So Laura from our audience asked, have there been any test results yet demonstrating how kids were impacted in math and reading and writing and socially as a result of COVID? Do we have anything from like,
You mean as in like kind of a pre-post? Not that I am aware of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I think there's, enough data in terms of, absenteeism and children's academic performance to show that there's been an adverse impact due to COVID.
Yeah.
Michigan State University has been doing really important research trying to track the impact during the pandemic. The research center there is called EPIC. And if you do a search on EPIC, they've released a lot of data finding that kids have been disproportionately impacted, kids of color, rural students, low-income students, particularly students with disabilities and English language learners have been among the kids most impacted. I think to the question about data and the question of like, how do you know how your student's doing? This is why annual summative assessments are so important. Our standardized assessments were put on hold during especially the first year of the pandemic, which made sense. But it's important that we have those annually. And it's important that we continue to have collect that data and assess our kids and how they're doing against national college and career ready benchmarks. And I think when we don't have that data, to your point, Jamie, how do you know how your kid's doing? Not just according to like your neighbor in your local community, but like, how do you know if they're being prepared well to succeed in a global economy? How do you know like if they're meeting these national standards, right, for teaching and learning? And I know that for me, like that was something that I really struggled with during the pandemic. I could see my daughter had fallen so far behind in reading and she was struggling a lot. She had just turned 8. I was worried about her going into 3rd grade. And I met with her new teacher in September. And I said, I know we don't have all this data, but like, is there other assessments you could do? Because I really think she's behind in reading. And they did. And they did find that she was behind in reading, and they set up twice weekly interventions with her for the whole school year. And it made all the difference. Like she caught all that up. And then she got back on grade level. But I only knew that she got on grade level because then she finally took the assessment, the Michigan M-STEP the following spring. And then I could see like how she was doing against these national standards. So it's important that we keep that assessment. It's important that we keep the same assessment, because if we don't and the state changes the assessment over the next year or two, we won't know what happened. We won't have any baseline data from pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and we need to know that. And the truth is, parents need to know that. If your child is 2 years behind in reading, you need to know, and you certainly want to know before they take the ACT in 11th grade and say, oh my gosh, I thought, my son was ready, was prepared to go to Michigan State, right? And he's reading at a 9th grade reading level. And it's so much better and easier to catch kids up when they're younger. It's less embarrassing for them, right? As we all know, having all been teenagers before, how hard it is when you're not fitting in with your peers as a teenager. So all of those things are like really important, I think, for data advocacy and empowering parents with that data and being transparent about it.
The report that Jane put together sort of highlights, what's sort of wrong. I remember I used to work at WDIV for years, and so I'd be in the morning strategy session. I was in the station, so it was like before COVID. And I just remember like the house was on fire, like in terms of education. And I think that the house is like, we're burning down a lot right now. And and this is to anyone, do you believe that the people that are making decisions, the people that are in power, the people that are in the education industry know that the house is on fire? Like, are we, I kind of equate it to this, right? So growing up around Detroit and living in Detroit for the last 20 something years, it wasn't until the bankruptcy that we kind of reconfigured some things to make us successful. And I wonder if the same thing could apply to the education system. I know it's not dollars and cents, and it's much more, dollars and cents are part of it, but it's a much more complex system to make education work. Do you think that the powers that be know that our house is on fire when it comes to education?
So I would like to jump in here because this is something that is burning within me. So the short answer is yes, I do. And one source of frustration, I'm really interested in hearing what Andrea and Amber have to say about this. But I believe that there is a good part of the problem is a lack of political will. I mean, there's data out here. It's not, what's wrong with education. I mean, why are children struggling? We have so much of this information. I have to take a minute to applaud New Detroit for wanting to keep putting this kind of data and research out there for the community to see, because you're distracted with so many different things in our lives. So it's important to keep this out here and remind people, but the data exists. It's here. It's, I think, a matter of making the decisions that these are priorities and they're going to be supported. It's important to keep in mind that, so the report obviously focused on education, the impact of COVID on education and on students, but it wasn't possible to write it without lightly touching on some of the other issues, because housing insecurity, economic inequality, they're all connected, and there is a ton of data out here. Not that there's not additional research that still needs to be done. Yes, that's true, but do we have enough information now in order to know that better decisions need to be made? Absolutely.
So Jamie, can I jump on to Jane's response? So I would say yes and no. So Jane, I would say the data is there, but that doesn't mean that they're connected to the data. So I bring trails up as a great example of the Michigan Department of Education said we need to address school mental health. We know that there's a problem, but I think we approached them with a solution and gave them the data on trails and gave them data on best practices and what had worked in other states. So I think they know, but I think a role we play is informing them on solutions and, hey, here's what works, here's the data, we have evidence. So we were able to do that with trails and get some additional state support to move trails forward. So I would say the data is there, but we have to help them connect them to the data, put it out there, make it available, and show solutions.
I would love to, can I jump in too, Jamie?
Go right ahead.
I was going to say, I was talking with a principal in a high poverty district in West Michigan a few days ago, and she was sharing that she had never seen the school that she works in a more fragile place. And not only was the work overwhelming, but again, people are exhausted. And so she certainly no. And I think when you talk to folks in high poverty communities in particular, I think a lot of people have known for a long time. We did a parent survey early last calendar year, that showed African-American parents in particular were the most likely to say, I'm worried about my kids in school. They're falling behind. There's a problem here. I think where the challenge is at the grass tops level and in Lansing, it often doesn't help politicians get votes by saying we have a huge problem in public education, right? Yeah. So, and that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of political capital. And so political leaders need to hear from people, right? That they want them to be honest. They want them to say, we have a problem. We're going, the improvement starts with being honest about where we are, and we're not in a good place. And I'm going to be committed to tackling that, but they need support. They can't win or stay in office without that kind of support. And so I think, again, like whatever way that you engage in that process, like making that a priority for leaders is so important. It just hasn't been a priority. I think, I do think people know. I think lots of people know in Lansing. It's just, there's been so many other things competing for those, fix the damn roads and all kinds of other, and it's not that those things aren't important. It's just that fire's been going on, to use your analogy, Jamie, for so long. It's been well over a decade. And in communities of color, let's face it, it's been going on for decades. Mm-hmm. Like some of these things have been happening since I was a kid. So, and I'm old. So, we need to, it's that political will. And I think like those leaders need support, and they need to hear from people. If they're hearing from people that this is fine, but I want you to fix my roads, that's what they're going to focus on. Right. And that's what's happened.
Yeah. I just want to add, Amber, you couldn't be more correct. And in all fairness, the reason we were able to have these conversations with the Michigan Department of Education is because COVID has made it undeniable for us not to talk about mental health needs. So, I think it was really bad even before the pandemic, but you can't really escape it. It has to be addressed. Therefore, it's a priority now, and there's a willing voice. So like you said, it just depends on if they're willing to talk to you and if it is a priority. And in this case, mental health, you cannot escape that anymore.
And I think that's also a function of who it's impacting. And so at the point where it becomes so pervasive that this isn't perceived as, an urban problem, well now, and that's where political will comes in. And so has this been an issue all along? Absolutely. Now is it on people's radar because it's impacting a broader segment of the population? Yes. So we need to be able to get to the point where we have the data and there's the political will there to use the data to make the right decisions.
That's a good point, Jane. So in the last 5 minutes, we have, let's talk about a little bit of student recovery. Amber, before we went live, you and I were, we were talking with the group. What is Lansing and DC doing in terms of student, and anyone can answer this, but it seems like it's directed to you, is in terms of student recovery and funding towards that, like dealing with this exact issue of how COVID has affected students. Is there money? Are there programs? What's going on in that space?
So I think it's a good news, tough news story. I think there's a lot of bipartisan work going on right now in Lansing to tackle some, again, things that have been happening well before COVID, but it just exacerbated them. There's a bipartisan effort, for example, to completely reform the state's education system around barriers to reading in elementary school in particular, and addressing issues like dyslexia, so that kids are identified, and once they're identified, if they have these barriers, that schools will have to provide them supports and services. And that might not sound like a big deal, but there hasn't been the political will in Michigan to do that for more than 30 years. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And the fact that both Republicans and Democrats are coming together with such urgency around it, have been working really hard on that for the last couple of years to push that through legislature, I think is great news. I think there's also emerging bipartisan interest in investing more in at-risk students. Again, this is a long-term change, but so important. I think there's also kind of the tough news story though. And it's a very mixed district by district. Districts have, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars in federal stimulus dollars for recovery efforts. There's a collaborative of journalism organizations, including Chalkbeat Detroit, doing really great work to try to track and see how that money's being spent. If it's being spent based on evidence-based, research-based recovery efforts. And it's the news has been very mixed. There's some districts are doing that. They're investing in things like tutoring, which is one of the best ways that individual time with students focused on them with best practice tutoring is one of the best ways, most important, effective ways that we can do to catch them up if they have fallen behind. The bad news is that many districts aren't spending their money that way. And so there's a lot of concern that these federal stimulus dollars will be opportunity wasted. It's not that things like, roofs, school roofs and boilers and those things are important too. But ultimately, they don't necessarily catch kids up who have fallen really behind during the pandemic. And so we're among the organizations that have been really urging districts to invest in the most effective strategies that are going to benefit students directly. That's what the federal stimulus dollars were for. That was the Biden administration's intent when it released and pushed out, hundreds of millions of dollars to districts. So we think it should be used for that purpose.
Okay, we have 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask for a round robin, 30 seconds each, final thoughts, and then we'll say our goodbyes. So Andrea, you're up first.
I'm just going to start with saying that, our kids can't thrive and focus on learning and be successful and recover in other areas of their life if they don't get their mental health needs met. So I'm happy to see that people are actually starting to recognize that.
That's awesome. Jane?
I think because one of the things that we do is evaluation, what I would like to see is just some pulling together some of these key metrics and indicators so that to track, what's going on with school funding, what kind of progress is being made in terms of, changing the model, in terms of mental health, support for students, and, equitable funding, those key issues so that we can, if they're out here on a regular basis, then we can track and see what is happening or not. It makes it easier to stay on top of those issues.
All right, and then Amber?
Building what Andrea and Jane said, I think the data are essential and parents have to demand it. We can't close gaps if we don't know that they exist. We can't ask policymakers to fix problems that we don't have any evidence exist. And trust me, like we find this all the time. People say, prove it, prove there's a problem, right? And we have to make sure that we keep our systems of assessment, of reporting, and really move to more transparency. I think that will help parents become more active and empowered. But I also think we're at a moment of fatigue, and it's so tempting to disengage when you're tired, right? And it's just widespread. It's in the water. Everybody I know is exhausted. It's been an exhausting couple of years. And I think that would be that's tempting, but it's absolutely not the place that we need to move toward. We need to move toward being more active and more assertive about pressing and creating that political will that we've been talking about today.
All right, we've hit our time. So just final thoughts, give me a minute and we can be done. But I just want to say that education is a huge factor in the success of our state in terms of widespread prosperity, high paying wages, quality of life, and fighting poverty. And we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of intentional work to do. And it's conversations like this that are really helpful to making those things happen. I want to thank Marshall Favors for producing this. I want to thank New Detroit for holding this event. And if you want to read the entire report, you can go to newdetroit.org. And if you get, there's like a little tab, I think it's like research or something like that. You go there and then you can get to the full report. And I think Marshall put the link in the chat. I want to say that today's town hall is supported by Fifth Third Bank. If you can help move New Detroit's racial equity work forward by visiting the website and signing the Declaration of War Against Racism and signing up to receive their newsletter. Sign up to receive the newsletter. It starts a dialogue. And I just want to thank everyone for coming. And I want to thank our guests, Andrea, Amber, and Jane. I appreciate your insights into this. And thank you everyone for coming.
Great
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great week.
You too.
You too.